to blunt adversary advantages through increased force agility, harnessing advanced technologies, and a new approach to force design. In the November 2018 report by the Commission on the National Defense Strategy for the United States, they issued a chilling forecast for the nation, and I quote, "American forces will face harder fights and greater losses than at any time in decades. Americans could face a decisive military defeat," unquote. A consensus has grown since the release of the latest National Defense Strategy that the United States has to change its preferred way of war to prevail in future peer-on-peer contests. In particular, the United States must address the burgeoning threat that China poses and the way in which it's carefully designed its systems warfare strategy to counter America's traditional way of war. By targeting U.S. data links, disrupting information flows, denying command and control, and targeting physical nodes of the U.S. information system, China plans to systematically blind U.S. commanders and paralyze our operations. This is why the U.S. future force design must be focused on filling the gaps inherent in the current force. These gaps include, 1, inventories of highly capable, high-end multifunction platforms that are too small, thereby increasing the vulnerability of U.S. operational architectures. 2, the inefficient practice of buying multiple kinds of high-end weapon systems in limited numbers, not providing the force capacity needed for great power conflict. 3, taking too long to develop and field major new weapon systems. 4, a current force design that cannot appropriately scale across the entire spectrum of conflict. And 5, critical elements of current U.S. force design that cannot withstand attrition. Mosaic is a force design that addresses the demands of the future strategic environment and the shortcomings of the current force. It exploits both the ability of advanced networks to seamlessly share information across an entire area of operations and capitalize on recent developments in processing, computing, and networking. Functional capabilities such as radar, fire control, and missiles that once had to be hosted on a common platform can now be disaggregated into their smallest practical elements. In the Mosaic concept, platforms are decomposed into their smallest practical functions, creating collaborative nodes in a network kill web that's highly resilient and can remain operationally effective even if the adversary destroys elements of it. Mosaic uses highly resilient networks of redundant nodes and multiple kill paths to minimize the critical friendly forces nodes that an enemy could target. This ensures Allied forces are effective in contested environments. Yet at the same time, disaggregated functionality will allow a Mosaic force to be highly adaptable across the spectrum of military operations. It combines the attributes of highly capable, high-end systems with the volume and agility afforded by numerous smaller force elements that can be rearranged into many different configurations or presentations. When composed together, these elements complete observe, orient, decide, act, or OODA loops, and kill chains. Like Lego blocks that universally fit together, Mosaic forces can be composed in a way to create adaptive force packages that can effectively target an adversary's system. The Mosaic force design, however, is more than just an advanced information architecture. It offers a comprehensive model that encompasses requirements and acquisition processes, the creation of new operational concepts, as well as new force presentations. Implementing it will require and challenge issues of doctrine, tradition, parochialism, and bureaucratic fiefdoms. To migrate to this kind of force design is going to require investment in the following areas of development. 1, automated technologies that can share information across different security levels and do so automatically. 2, policies for test, validation, and verification of artificial intelligence. 3, multiple approaches to spoof-proofing artificial intelligence. 4, commitment to achieving current force structure goals. 5, focus on the cost effectiveness of force design alternatives, not simply cost. 6, fielding Mosaic enablers, and 7, experiments with Mosaic operational concepts, architectures, and empowered command and control at the edge. Mosaic type operations are not new to the Air Force, and the service is then perhaps the best candidate to take the lead role in developing a Mosaic force design concept that could reshape DoD's planning, process, force structure, and operations. Since our military backstops the national security strategy, the United States must out-adopt adversaries who have and are continuing to adapt to an obsolescing current U.S. force design. That said, the United States can migrate to a more effective force. What cannot migrate is resistance to a new way of war within a defense culture that today is largely conditioned by an atypical era of absolute military dominance, permissive threat environments, and a lack of peer adversaries. Mosaic warfare offers an alternative that's aimed at the future, not the past. And we plan for plenty of time for your questions after our panel discussion, but first, before we turn the podium over to Heather for a presentation in more detail, let me turn over the mic to Dr. Grayson for some of your remarks. Sure. Tim?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dave. Thank you all for being here this morning and for your attention. Thank you to Mitchell Institute for the really great work that they've done on this study. Very excited to see the rollout of this. Just a couple words of how we look at this notion of Mosaic warfare. In a single phrase, it's about monolith busting. So you hear a lot of things today about multi-domain C2, now it's joint all-domain C2, things of this nature, where the military has recognized the importance, as really Dave was highlighting, of creating new capabilities that aren't reliant on single point of failure monolithic platforms. So that's an exciting thing, and we're in very exciting times as really all the services at the joint level we're moving to more of this, I'll call it system of systems type of thinking. Here's the danger, and this is why DARPA is looking at this as a technical problem. We can replace monolithic platforms with monolithic architectures. And without any intended disparagement, for those of you who were old enough or were involved with something the Army tried at a massive scale in this, there was a program almost 20 years ago now called Future Combat System. That was very much, and I'll give them credit, an innovative system of systems kind of thought process. But it relied upon a single monolithic, massively complex architecture to create the solution. And then we saw all the inherent, we didn't even get to the point where we got to see the inherent brittleness operationally that comes from that. We could just, it died under the weight of the own complexity of how do you even implement that. So what we are doing, trying to do under our DARPA Mosaic warfare portfolio, is to enable the ability to create what I'll call a warfighting architecture, which would be a force package or force development, as you'll hear more about from Mitchell. Be able to defer the decision to what that warfighting architecture is going to be as close as possible to time of need. How do we enable, how do we build the technologies and the infrastructure to enable the actual operators to make decisions about what I'm going to piece together and how I'm going to define a particular system of systems capability, as opposed to treating it as an acquisition problem. It fixes all kinds of woes that we see today as policy problems. For example, one of the favorite policy issues that people like to poke at is the JSID's requirement process. Okay, it can be burdensome. It's blamed for a lot of the slow upfront challenges in our acquisition system, but it's there for a good reason, the way we operate today and the way we develop the force today. We have to, if we're not going to get a new capability for, say, another 20 or 30 years, we've got to make sure that what we're delivering today is the right thing. So of course we study it. Of course we want to try to be as accurate and thorough as possible. Of course we want to include all the possible requirements of everything we think we might want to do for those next 30 years. think about, in contrast, what an operator has to worry about if there's a conflict that breaks out. You know, he or she is worried about, what's that sight picture right in front of me? There's no uncertainty there. There's no studying. There's no forecasting or projecting. I know what my mission is. I know what the adversary is. I'm going to go figure out a way to execute. There's a tremendous benefit that comes from certainty and focus and control of scale and complexity by knowing explicitly what the problem is. But we don't have crystal balls. We can't predict the problem 30 years into the future. So if I can be able to say, look, I will give you a new capability 45 minutes from now, I could think about just focusing on the problem of what's going to happen in the next set of sorties. If the technology doesn't support that, but I can give you a new capability 2 days from now. Okay, now I can think about delivering an entirely new capability every, what we think of today as an ATO cycle. Maybe the answer is only I can deliver you a new capability a month or two from now. Okay, now it's something that maybe I have to think a little bit more deliberately about and set the table with more options up front. But I've still taken it out of needing to create the one set of monolithic answers for the next 20 or 30 years. So that's fundamentally what we're trying to do at DARPA. So we're building a portfolio of programs. I'm not going to go into them today, but I can at least touch on some of them in the Q&A. But they essentially fall in 3 areas that I think roughly align with the types of technologies that Dave alluded to. The first is planning technologies. How do I even figure out what I want this force architecture to look like based upon that need? Today we do that spending years in battle labs and war games and lots of doctrinal kinds of development. Now I'm looking at it, smaller scale, more focused, but I've got to decide fast. There are a lot of things, and this is where the core of the technology is and what we think of as interoperability. When this involves machine-to-machine connectivity, how do we create that machine-to-machine connectivity really close to that time of need? Delivering, call it interoperability on demand, as opposed to saying everything's got to be part of this one monolithic architecture complying to one global standard. That again is really hard to do and very brittle. And then finally, and I think that this is an area Animal will get into, if I've given a warfighter a whole set of new capabilities and a whole set of new plans and the way they're going to be used as a force package, and he or she hasn't spent years developing tactics, validating those tactics, and then training and getting certified to those tactics, how is the human going to operate in this kind of environment, and especially in a very resilient type of way? So we are actually developing technologies that address each of those macro level challenges and breaking those apart down to a finer scale, and that's where a lot of our programs are focused on. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it over and happy to address more of that as we go into the Q&A.
Thanks, Stu.
Thank you. So this briefing is about future force design, the things we have and how we use them. Our intention is for this report to be a unifying document. By articulating a reason and a vision for this force design, we're seeking to connect our resourcing, force structure, doctrine, operational constructs, and harmony against an adversary threat in a way that enables us to execute the strategy our nation needs. Slide. After 17 years of counterinsurgency and low-intensity conflict in permissive environments, the 2018 National Defense Strategy represented a dramatic shift by elevating great power competition between nation states as the primary concern in U.S. national security. For many who have been watching the rise of China and a resurgent Russia, this shift was no surprise. This quote from the introduction of the National Defense Strategy speaks to the end of this unipolar world, where the U.S. was the only global power, to now a strategic environment where we see our relative power diminished compared to China and Russia. I think this phrase, strategic atrophy, is particularly telling. In this context, it refers to the period of the 30 years that the U.S. had no peer strategic competitor. But during this time, we also stopped really thinking about how to compete in a great power contest. Thus, strategic atrophy can also be used to describe our own state of defense strategic thinking. The National Defense Strategy Commission, a bipartisan committee charged by Congress to review the 2018 NDS, issued dire warnings last November regarding the state of our military. Our military is unprepared to fight a high-end conflict against another great power. And despite the Commission's view that this shift towards focusing again on great power competition, stressing Russia and China, that this was the right direction, they also stated that the NDS does not adequately explain how we should get there. In other words, there's no real strategy in our national defense strategy. This omission is evident when we look at how the department is generally approaching the thorny challenge of A2AD, anti-access and area denial. These rings are likely familiar to everyone within the audience. A2AD defenses are intended to prevent our entry into the battle space, and if we get there, prevent our maneuver. Given that the American way of war is inherently offensive, projecting power, a lot of attention is being given to how to counter these threats. The problem is we're focusing on how to fight their stuff, not fight their strategy. This is a particularly perilous approach when facing China. China has meticulously studied the Gulf War when the coalition air campaign blinded and paralyzed the Iraqi leadership and military through targeting key system nodes. And the result was that now China is developing their own theory of system conflict. System warfare is not about maneuver or attrition. By targeting those key elements, nodes, and networks, system warfare seeks to collapse an adversary's ability to fight. China has also had now 30 years to study America's way of war and to understand exactly how and what to target in order to render our forces similarly blind, confused, and paralyzed. Specifically, China will target our data links and information networks to disrupt our information flows. Second, they'll target the key nodes of our operational system, specifically, again, our command and control. They'll seek to degrade our operational architecture, how we fight, to get inside of our decision cycles and induce even further confusion. This is how China intends to get inside of our OODA loop to achieve their decision superiority and their operational initiative. Our force design, the weapons we have and how we employ them, is inadequate to survive against such a strategy. Now, if we'd not gutted our military after the Soviet Union, and we had actually procured the planned number of B-2s, F-22s, had maintained the ramp on F-35 and pursued next generation bomber in 2008 as intended, we might not be having this conversation today because we would have capability and capacity. But the DoD also did not pursue maturing systems warfare in the 1990s and its corollary effects-based operations. Those were rejected. All of the services today now are in dire need of recapitalization, but none more so than the Air Force, which is smaller and older than it has ever been in its history. Having spent the last 17 years in extremely permissive environments, our force is too small, our information systems too brittle, our command and control, and even our execution too centralized to withstand systems warfare. So this table looks at the strategic consequences of our current force design. For example, the information networks that have enabled incredibly efficient operations in the Middle East have also incentivized the centralization of command and control and execution of operations. We know that sharing information is crucial to effective operations, but we've become dependent on what are fairly brittle and fragile networks. This opens up a lucrative targeting opportunity for adversaries. Our incredibly powerful multifunction weapon systems, like any of the stealth fleet, have taken decades to develop and field, and when budget pressures have reduced their quantities, it's left us with small fleets that cannot provide the attack density a pure conflict will require. The loss of a single one of these platforms can be operationally devastating. For example, one B-2 is 5% of that fleet. And it's so precious that when one was nearly catastrophically lost to an engine fire, the decision was made to rebuild it at great expense because it was so necessary and that fleet so small. As a result, we've become dependent on domain dominance to execute our combat operations. We have to roll back adversary defenses before we're able to start the real combat operations. Today's force simply cannot accept attrition. So in this table on the right-hand side, you then see what the current design In this table, we see the current force design through the context of a pure competition employing a system warfare approach. There's always a balance, a trade-off between defensive and offensive systems on any platform. But when a force structure is so small that the system cannot withstand attrition and still prosecute effects, the defense-offensive balance skews towards focusing increased effort on survivability. The more a force is biased towards survivability, the less pressure it places against an adversary, and the more initiative it surrenders to the adversary. Without quantity, each platform is very nearly a critical node, a high-value asset whose loss disproportionately degrades operations and cannot keep the necessary operational tempo, and the lack of concentration and mass that's a result of that small force cannot keep pressure on the adversary. It allows that adversary to adapt, respond, and retake the initiative. And because we've allowed our command and control to become so centralized, it also now is a lucrative target in system warfare. Likewise, the limited force structure means that the predictable force presentations and the decades it takes to field these new capabilities also makes us very predictable. On the right-hand side of this chart, we then see what is needed in a future force. We have to be able to rebalance between the defensive and offensive, regain the initiative. And through quantity, we need enough diversity and disaggregation of functionality that we don't simply complicate the adversary's targeting, we confound it because there are no critical nodes. With enough capacity, that quality of quantity, we can then sustain the tempo, concentration, mass, and retain the initiative. And of course, C2 must be done across the battle space edge as forward as possible, and the cycles across the entire enterprise, from operations to planning to acquisition, has to be accelerated so that we can surprise the adversary. We must ensure that they cannot anticipate what is coming. So what do we mean by mosaic force design? Like a mosaic piece of art, a mosaic force is composed of many smaller, heterogeneous pieces that can be combined together in very nearly any way and at any scale to create the necessary force presentation. It may appear unpredictable and chaotic, but when viewed from a system level, it makes sense. A mosaic force design is fundamentally about system warfare. It decomposes the functional capabilities, disaggregating them into their smallest practical components. When one thinks of what needs to be accomplished in the battle space, we can abstract these functionalities into the familiar OODA loop: orienting, observing, deciding, and acting. These small functional pieces we then call nodes, and the glue that holds them together, that enables them to operate as a system, are the advanced information networks and data links. So, for example, an F-16 in an air-to-air engagement would need to first observe the airspace in its lane for enemy aircraft with its radar. In this case, the radar would be the observation node. When the radar received a return, that contact would be processed through the fire control computer and displayed on the radar scope. That would be the orientation node, creating meaning out of that data, out of that observation. The pilot might engage other onboard sensors to add additional observations in order to upgrade their orientation, their understanding of that battle space, and then decide on an action. In this case, the pilot would be the decision node, and the weapon, should he choose to employ that, would be the action. As information became ever more critical through the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s to enable precision engagements, the only way to reap the benefits of information was to integrate more and more sensors and processors onto a single platform. This made sense. It made us far more effective. But advancements in data links have made it possible to first virtually disaggregate these functionalities and then physically disaggregate them into nodes. We envision Mosaic being a combination of simple function, for example, a platform that is only an observation node, and multifunction platforms, more traditional, for example, the like F-35s. Now, we're using air-breathing examples, but by abstracting functionality into observe, orient, decide, and act, that enables us to be agnostic about the platform. All that really matters is the function. And by becoming agnostic and abstracting into that functionality, we can then be more creative and innovative in how we combine these different platforms, whether they're traditional, highly capable platforms like fifth-generation aircraft, or simple function platforms that are simply focused on one particular function like observing or orienting. You can imagine something like an X-47 UCAS with several sensors on board as an observation node, or even perhaps a swarm of small, collaborative, limited life vehicles with miniaturized sensors that could be dispensed from a B-21, and maybe those sensors self-destruct over time. System functionality is enabled through the advanced networks, but it isn't something that's linear or self-contained. Just as a force ship of F-35s sharing information across a flight are far more powerful than just a single F-35, it's the sharing of information that makes Mosaic a powerful force design. We expect that advances in processing will enable pushing the specialized and large processing that needs to occur to support this functionality to the battle space edge. This is not a traditional sort of commercial cloud concept where server farms in the Nevada desert are doing all of the processing necessary for operators at the battle space edge to take action. That processing has to occur within the battle space at the edge. It's a push, not a pull of information. And this will enable enough high-fidelity orientation and command and control to happen, building a common operating picture that is able to build execution from the edge aft to higher echelons, not from the top down. It's also important to understand that Mosaic force design pursues kill webs, not kill chains. The resiliency comes through the redundancy of the pathing. Multiple simultaneous kill paths are pursued against targets until the desired effect is achieved. This is how Mosaic can withstand platform and information attrition. No critical node, no critical network will collapse a system or break a kill chain. As a consequence, Mosaic doesn't simply pose a wicked problem to the adversaries. It confounds the adversary's ability to meaningfully target us. But we need to begin getting into specifics. We can say agile and resilient all day long, but until we talk about the how, it's simply empty rhetoric. This is why presenting a notional and abstracted operational architecture is important. Slide. Before we get into the description of what you see here on the slides, let me first emphasize that this is deliberately, again, an abstracted architecture. We feel it's important to focus on the functionality of how the operations will occur, because we need to be able to enable technological innovation in the future, new capabilities to be able to integrate into the operations, and have a heterogeneous force, not one that is brittle, not one that is overly complex, and not one that becomes obsolescent almost immediately upon fielding because it is so strict. So for example, we could compose an observational fabric with many different kinds of sensors, but we also want to enable, again, that technological growth. Being overly specific or prescriptive with regards to the technology risks condemning a force design to obsolescence. So we felt that it was important to conceptualize the operational architecture abstract enough that it could be enduring as we begin to plug new technologies into the system. So you can ignore the little airplane shapes that you see on the slide. They don't represent an actual platform. What matters are the colors, because those colors are the functionality. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see the red triangles. Those are, yes, targets of interest, so they're very familiar to us. The blue circles are observation nodes. The green dots and planes represent orientation nodes. Yellow represents a decision node. Orange, an action node that can deliver an effect. So you can see, for example, the F-35 type silhouettes are multicolored. This is not to represent an actual F-35, but rather a multifunction platform within the battle space. In this notional and abstracted operational architecture, we have some operational observation nodes that are beginning to detect targets of interest, right? Slide. Next, these observation nodes could collaboratively cross-queue other observation nodes to upgrade the information that they've detected, that they've gathered, to create a multi-static look of the battle space, or perhaps even multimodal or multi-phenomena looks. It could be that some level of AI or even just a rule-based hierarchy can help prioritize how to cross-queue and collaborate these observation nodes within this sensor type fabric. Slide. Observation nodes would then share their information with orientation nodes. This is where you would get the fusion of that information. These orientation nodes we expect would have high processing demands, would have certain levels of artificial intelligence and machine learning to enable them to correlate, evaluate, fuse, filter, and determine the best of best information to create a high fidelity common operating picture. But there may also be different kinds of orientation nodes, battlespace pictures, blue force trackers, and so forth. Slide. These orientations are needed by the decision nodes, which may also have decision aids to help them prioritize and pair available actors against targets. So like a forward air controller in an A-10 who keeps track of the aircraft in his CAS stack, he needs to know what kind of aircraft he has, their capabilities, their weapons loadout, their fuel remaining, their loiter time, and so forth, and has to be able to effectively match those aircraft against the targets he has available. This would be something perhaps similar to a decision aid that would be offered up. In the kill web, it's possible that an actor might also have prioritized targets because multiple kill orders are continually updating. This is one reason why command and control must occur at the edge to quickly and effectively synchronize these types of operations. But keeping multiple kill paths and orders alive is essential to ensuring resilience in a contested battle space. Slide. Finally, although multiple kill paths may be activated, only the surviving priority match executes. Now, we've shown this entire sequence to be fairly static. We've seen no motion, but it's important to understand that the battle space is constantly moving, very dynamic, always updating and continually evolving. And we've also represented this as fairly sequential, but in reality, it's continuous. Slide. The first of our recommendations to transform our current force may seem counterintuitive, but it is crucial. The Air Force is the oldest and smallest that it's been since the beginning of 1947. We cannot cancel current programs of record or divest any remaining force structure for the promise of something on PowerPoint. The development of Mosaic capabilities is not going to happen overnight, and while some may advocate for bold moves and trade-offs, we must remember that bold does not always equal wise. Terminating current programs and divesting force structure will only exacerbate our current vulnerabilities. We must aggressively invest in developing and fielding Mosaic enablers. The technologies like autonomy, artificial intelligence for orientation, decision aids, smart routing, all of the connective tissue that enables a Mosaic force. These Mosaic enablers will unlock the power of current platforms as we learn to use these older capabilities in new ways. And as simple function platforms are fielded, will make the entire force design even that more effective. Mosaic enablers are about changing how we employ, not just what we have. Mosaic enablers create the path for the current force to migrate to the future force. There are some bureaucratic challenges, though, that must be addressed as we transition and recreate these Mosaic enablers. First, we must develop an automated technology that can real-time share information across security levels while providing the necessary protection for those technologies. We must develop multiple and complementary approaches to assuring that our artificial intelligence and machine learning is not corrupted. And we must also develop new policy to account for how to test, validate, and verify artificial intelligence and machine learning, which by nature changes as it learns. We need to begin right now developing with experimenting Mosaic operational concepts, the architectures, and how we actually execute command and control at the battlespace edge. It will take years to fully develop the potential for a Mosaic operational concept, and actively experimenting with those technologies, whether or not those enablers are still in development or as we begin to field those, is crucial to identifying additional technologies that are necessary and ensuring that the information networks and command and control structures are aligned to enable rapid operations. As a historical example, it took Sir Hugh Dowding 5 years of experimentation to develop the air defense radar home chain system that enabled Britain to defy the Luftwaffe in 1940 and 1941. We will need likely that much time. And finally, we must conduct an operationally focused cost assessment of these force design alternatives. As General Deptula mentioned, it isn't ultimately cost that matters, it's cost for effect that matters. But in a hybrid force of simple and multifunction, what is the appropriate ratio? And it must be done within an operational context. What is the cost of continuing on as business as usual? That's the cost that we need to be comparing ourselves to. What is necessary to win? Any smart strategy must take resources into account. Otherwise, it's nothing but pretty words. But the victim of cost imposition should be the adversary, not ourselves. We need to ensure that as we go forward, we fully understand the appropriate ratio to ensure that we are providing the necessary resources to execute the strategy. We must modernize for system warfare, and this means that we must begin to consider what a Mosaic force design looks like and begin investing in those technologies. Thank you. What I'd like to do now before we get into your questions, what I'd like to do is facilitate a conversation among our panelists. So we have prepared a few questions to begin the conversation. So one, for Dr. Grayson and for Animal, is something that I think a lot of us have concerns about, because Mosaic as an operational concept relies very heavily on connectivity. And disrupting our networks are one of the ways that we see adversaries in system warfare seeking to disrupt our operations. So can you talk to the availability and security of these data links and connections?
Sure, I'll start and then I'll hand it off to Animal. So first thing is sort of the obvious, and I'm also probably obvious not going to talk a lot about it. We're always building things that are more secure, more robust kind of links, and we're still interested in that kind of technology. However, I think the thing that is new in the thinking is, and it fits, and this is the whole theme of Mosaic, we aren't relying on every single link being perfect. So a lot of what we're looking at is adaptability of our networks. We are looking at technology to be able to do networks of networks. We're looking at technology to enable heterogeneous networks, to enable networking on demand. So instead of saying, I've got to make sure that link stays up despite whatever the challenges are, I might say instead, what are my opportunities? How can I be opportunistic to find a link that is up and available? Another way we think of that, a cute little term, but I think it's telling, C2 of C. How can we actually look at tasking and command and control of communications to give us the link that is the best link available at a given time that we need, as opposed to assuring that every link is going to stay up all the time. Now, another key part of it, and I'm going to hand it over to Animal for this, is let's get away from needing to rely upon those networks being always up all the time and densely meshed. And that gets into how we use technology to push the notion of mission command and C2 at the edge.
Yeah, you can imagine, first off, thank you for letting me participate here today. I would say you can imagine that the problem set that we're working with fundamentally is based on our ability to compose, orchestrate, and adapt. And what Dr. Grayson is essentially trying to get after is this concept of adaptation without this exquisite knowledge of the entire networked battle space that we have come to appreciate in the duration that Lucky had talked about earlier. Ultimately, with these sorts of things, you find that if we are able to have a more higher cognitive capacity in the elements that are making these decisions and distribute that to the edge, we don't have to necessarily have a infrastructure that is resilient to that at all costs, but rather offers us an opportunity for graceful degradation as the adversary starts to do that. And there are a variety of things that we're working on at DARPA right now, several programs that are effectively addressing specifically that point. I have a couple in my portfolio that are trying to think about this instead of from a top-down approach, which is our traditional way of command and control, rather from a more bottom-up. And there are a lot of things that we interact with on a daily basis out of e-commerce or think of Uber and eBay and those sorts of things that make us very familiar with these more bottom-up approaches that find spare capacity in the system. And this ability to adapt is kind of all about effectively that, finding spare capacity in the system, using it to our advantage, and giving this perception to the adversary that it is chaotic and unstructured, while we know how we're actually manipulating that.
So, Animal, you talked a little bit about some of the technologies that you're pursuing right now. And we know that Mosaic Force, as we envision it, will rely significantly on autonomy. Can you briefly discuss some of the other technologies that you're pursuing to address the challenges associated with autonomy at different scales?
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at pretty much any OV-1 that you see floating around the Pentagon, or even at DARPA, there are lots of lightning bolts, and there are lots of different systems that are on there, and they all operate in different domains. And there is an assumption that all of those things are somehow going to be realized in the future, and because we can put them on PowerPoint. Fundamentally, when you start looking at that problem and you experience it in real life, you find that finding these cross-domain options, these options that are outside of your domain, becomes very intractable from a human perspective. We as human beings just don't retain that volume of information, nor do we process it rapidly enough to make effective decisions. So decision aids, automation decision aids with regard to resource management, are extremely important. A handful of my programs, or a couple of my programs, basically span these scales, from handling this resource management problem as our sensors adapt and evolve to have extremely larger amounts of capability in them than what we traditionally grew up with, at the sub-platform level, to making these sorts of decisions at the program level, platform level, on an airplane itself, to abstracting it to these more macroscopic structures, right, that we're talking about with this Mosaic warfare piece. The element that I'm going to play a little bit off of the term Mosaic one more time. Lucky mentioned that we've obviously adapted the term from the art industry, right? That the Mosaic tiles are small, heterogeneous, they are different shapes and sizes, and the big element of that for the execution side of Mosaic warfare, to me, comes from our ability to change that picture. If you imagine yourself, or at least when I was a kid, doing puzzles with my grandmother, that puzzle was a lot like the Army example that Tim mentioned earlier. It takes a long time to build the puzzle. Each piece has a very specific spot, and if the pieces don't match up well, the entire thing kind of falls apart. As a result, it causes these long timelines. But if you imagine this more Mosaic piece, I can have a third grade kid start a picture of a puzzle of a sword and adapt it into a picture of a flag pretty much midstream, because of the way that these elements are initially created. And when it comes down to it, this adaptability really needs and will rely on a level of autonomy that this computer science industry is producing for us, and I think has tremendous potential in adapting these sorts of architectures.
So, Animal, you'd mentioned the small heterogeneous pieces, but our force right now for General Deptula is very multifunction. Matter of fact, our most powerful combat capabilities today, like the F-22, F-35, and soon the B-21, are multifunction. They're not these simple function, small tiles. So, sir, can you discuss the importance of these multifunction platforms like those that we have today in a Mosaic construct?
Yeah, obviously, well, maybe not so obviously, but one of the beauties of having multiple functions on multiple different kinds of platforms, and I eschew the use of the term exquisite, because it tends to single out something as very, very unique. And what we want to do with Mosaic is make what in the past may have been unique commonplace for a variety of different nodes. So it's a little bit of a twist on your question, but I think back to WW Desert Storm, when in order to get the information back on how a particular force package had done in other words, battle damage assessment, we had to rely on tertiary systems. You know, an RF-4 flying overhead and taking a picture, a satellite, if we could get access to one through the complex, archaic, Byzantine request process with the national security space architecture, which was so inflexible it just boggled the mind. And so we didn't count on it. But you had to rely on something else. 99.99% of the time, that something else never showed up in time. So it was like manna from heaven. Let me advance 10 years to my own personal experience when in Operation Enduring Freedom, the early days, a Global Hawk was delivered to the theater, which was under the direct control of the Joint Force Air Component Commander, who now could have at least, yes, a tertiary system, but the individual responsible and needing the information could have access to the information within a short period of time. Now imagine the introduction of a system like MQ-1, MQ-9, Predator Reaper, where you have the sensor and the shooter capability combined onto one platform. Now we truly went from days, if we were lucky, hours, to now single-digit minutes to be able to observe, you know, the OODA loop that we all talk about so well. We compress the OODA loop down to minutes, in some cases seconds. So having multiple capabilities on a single platform is a good thing. What we need to be able to do as we move forward into Mosaic is make the exquisite the commonplace, so that we can accelerate the decision process and move it away from these highly centralized Soviet-style command and control systems that the United States over the last 15 years has adopted. It boggles the mind. You know, when I was growing up, we eschewed centralized command and control, and today we've embraced it. What happened? We have to undo that.
Well, and that's why I'm very heartened to hear that some of the technologies that you're pursuing at DARPA are seeking to push that command and control and empower that at the battle space edge. So, Dr. Grayson, you've already described some of the technologies that you're pursuing to support a Mosaic force design, these enablers that we're talking about. Can you also describe how DARPA is really focusing on the operational need? We've all been familiar with how difficult it is to cross the valley of death from technology, research, and development into an actual program of record. But doing that will be incredibly crucial to developing that future force design. So you can discuss how you're working with the services, partnering with warfighters to ensure that the advanced technologies that you're developing have that higher probability of fielding.
Sure. So, first of all, I mean, there's an interesting saying that used to be popular at DARPA that I think thankfully has fallen on has sort of fallen by the wayside of DARPA hard. We still try to push the edge. We still try to be disruptive, but the old DARPA hard mantra led people to think, oh, I've got to have the gee whiz exquisite technology straight out of the lab that's going to give me a 10x performance improvement. And I had my own experiences back when Dave was there commanding OEF. I was putting things out into the mountains, and there were frustrations in that you could see the problem, and there wasn't necessarily a really hard technical aspect to the solution, but there were a bunch of things just in the complexity of how I had to bring them together that were really hard. The DARPA hard part was in the complexity, not in a technical widget. So I'm happy to say that really under the current DARPA leadership, Steve Walker and Peter Heinum, and actually starting under the prior DARPA leadership under Arthi Prabhakar, there's been a shift toward DARPA impact. Okay, in that regard, when we look at our Mosaic warfare portfolio, there are first of all, I like to say we gotta eat our own dog food. Okay, this notion of monolith busting. The most dangerous thing we could think of is to create a portfolio of DARPA programs. With no offense to one of my program managers here, you can't count on DARPA program managers to follow any kind of orders or sense of control. So it is in itself, DARPA is in itself a very federated, loosely coupled kind of environment. So we're looking at how do we build a portfolio to take advantage of that. So I will tell you, I am not going to say, here is a set of programs that if we do these programs will comprehensively make our department Mosaic. And I certainly won't say that on this date our department's going to be Mosaic. It's going to be a continuous, gradual process that's going to involve a very federated approach of warfighting as well as technology. And then to that end, we are looking at several different things. Our programs still have vector. We're trying to create vector. We're trying to use programs that by themselves solve some immediate purpose. And we can think of transitioning those to a traditional program office. At the same time, collectively, we're creating an example. There we go. I'm loud enough. We'll just talk like this. We're creating examples of how new organizational structure, whether it is acquisition organizational structure, whether it's actual warfighting organizational structure, the technologies can be a use case. And DARPA has some of the freedom and flexibility that the service labs, and for that matter battle labs, operational battle labs, don't have. So we can try things, we can demonstrate things, we can produce an example, and then to really close that tightly with the warfighter, we're doing a number of actual experimentation programs where we've got the warfighter directly engaged with us. And so they can be learning how to use these things in a different way, how to think about warfighting in a different way. And maybe the things they're innovating have nothing to do with technology themselves, but the technical experiments are creating opportunities for them to do operational experimentation at the same time.
Thank you very much. I know that we've gone a little long in terms of the planned program, but we still do have time for questions. So we'd like to open up the field.
John Kohut from Global Air.
Oh.
I'm trying this. John Kohut from Global Air Logistics and Training or GOLF. I just want to touch on one facet that you just mentioned, Dr. Grayson, which is the experimentation side. Traditionally, our programs are test requirement and very deterministically test to that. What thoughts do you have on how we might move toward experimenting with these systems that aren't really deterministic and ultimately get them through an operational test and out to the field and out to the fleet?
So a couple different aspects of that. First of all, a lot of the experimentation we're doing are more macro level experiments. And in that regard, some of the experiments might be against tactics. And it's an interesting statement that when we measure everything on the acquisition side of the world in terms of performance down to 6 nines of reliability, I can't say that there are too many requirements processes and metrics and testing measured against tactics development, even though the same rigor ultimately goes into tactics development. There's a different mindset. So we've got to take that tactics development mindset and apply to how we think about technology. Now there's certainly going to be limits, and a great example is how we might think of the use of AI. Clearly you want some boundary conditions. You don't want your AI going off and doing something really crazy or dangerous. At the same time, we want to allow flexibility and adaptability where you aren't going to predict every state of an AI system. So I'll put out a little sales pitch. We've got a new set of programmatics within DARPA called AI Exploration. And Stowe has just released a solicitation for a new AEI project called Create that it includes some of this boundary conditions on AI as part of that, so that you can have some notion of restriction, but yet at the same time allow, say, an autonomous team to function within that. So we got to become comfortable with soft edges. We have to become comfortable with the notion of, even if we're talking a tangible platform performance, if it's one of Animal's tiles he described in an art kit, I want to be able to think about assessing the capabilities of that, not guaranteeing that a capability is going to be at a certain level of performance, but do I know what the capability of that asset is going to be? So now in a Mosaic kill web, I can go ahead and understand what its role is going to be and how much it can give me toward a solution. So I think we still care about performance, we still care about reliability, but we've got to invert how we think about applying that level of confidence.
Hi, I'm Teresa Hitchens with Breaking Defense. Thank you for your presentation today. I have two questions. The first is, a lot of this sounds like you're doing a lot of things at once, so it's almost a throwing spaghetti at the wall kind of approach. Is there actually a roadmap that you can provide to us for how you intend to go through this step by step? And the second thing is, it also obviously is a long-term process. You're looking at a long term. Are there any things that you can do today to actually start shifting the paradigm today?
So, absolutely, and Animal might want to jump in on this as well, but I'll go back to the statement I just made a few moments ago. We got to eat our own dog food when it comes to this notion of adaptability and a federated type of approach. So I absolutely will not be giving you a roadmap that says, yea, verily, here is the exact list of programs, here is the Gantt chart of how they all line up, and on this date, after they're all successful, we will be Mosaic. Won't do it. I would argue can't be done, and if someone tried to do it, it would be ineffective and wrong. What I will say is, we do have a series of studies, and what Mitchell has been doing for us is one of these. We have others that have looked at the overall concept. We do the experimentation activities. We go through and start defining what are the problems. I love going around at slightly less formal sessions than this and lay out the vision and wait for really two reactions. One is, yeah, we all get it in terms of that's what we want for the end state. And then the second reaction are the eye rolls of how the heck are we ever going to get there? Well, I welcome the eye rolls because every time there's an eye roll, I then pull the thread a little bit and say, okay, tell me what the hard parts are. Tell me what the barriers are. And so we're using everything from studies like Mitchell's to interactions, whether it's informal interactions, talking to people, or more formal kinds of experimentation programs that we have to understand what are the hard parts. And again, we're not going to put a roadmap against it, but that helps us focus new technical capabilities that allow us to chip away at that. Let's address that one little problem. Great example is we realized we woke up one day and said, if we're trying to give the commander the ability to piece together a Mosaic force on the fly, wouldn't it be great if he or she knows what's available to piece together? We don't have that in our logistics process. So we went out and started a logistics situation awareness program called LogX. Okay, so that's how we're building the portfolio. And to your question about immediate impact, I'll pull the thread on LogX a little bit. One of the popular terms in the startup world is the notion of a minimum viable product. Okay, start with something that's a tangible, immediately realizable thing, and then figure out how to scale from there. So LogX is a great example of something where there are many, many immediate problems we can point to in our logistics enterprise. And LogX is, in a more traditional way, engaging with the stakeholders on those kind of problems. And that program will deliver some solutions to them that solve their problems today. At the same time, we've set the table with an option for someone who is thinking about future force design to say, here's a capability where I could give an operator a real-time picture of what's available to put together Mosaic. So it creates that vector.
Hey, Teresa, let me jump in here for a second, and without putting words in Tim's mouth, because I agree with him in terms of his perspective on not wanting to lay out a specific roadmap, with timelines and per chart and blah, blah, blah. I would offer that second chart that Heather put up there is the, quote, flight plan, if you will. Now, those are macro level, where we are today, where we need to be in the future, but now decompose each one of those into what needs to be done from moving from the left side of the chart to the right side of the chart. And there's a heck of a lot that needs to be done in each one of those elements. But I mean, if there's a guideline you're looking for, that's it.
We understand those of you that need to leave at 9:30, but we do have the opportunity to actually continue the conversation for another 10 minutes. So, sir, I believe you had a question here?
Thank you. David Isby, Air International. Dr. Grayson, the different Mosaic parts, however, how do you ensure that they will in fact line up like a Lego ball? The other services have all different views of this, and people are looking at different systems. The OV1 level, each service has a different view to the key question: what is the nature of future war? And at a time when more of the procurement system has gone to the service rather than the DoD level, rather than imposing a top-down, how do you make sure that there aren't multiple competing Legos?
So I think multiple competing Legos is actually a good thing. And I'll come back to monolith busting. We don't want to go dictate that there be a top-down monolithic architecture that everyone must comply to. Instead, we're trying to say, how can things grow and evolve together in a federated manner? So one of the things I'll play off of one of the things Dave mentioned. We've got to keep going with the capabilities we have. In my former government life, I actually sat on the acquisition as opposed to the S&T side of the table. And we used to refer to the problem of changing the tires on the moving truck. If I'm sitting there facing an immediate program of record, I can't take a step back and say, you know what, I'm going to risk gapping one of our warfighting capabilities because there might be this great thing available to me 5 or 10 years from now. But where I get so frustrated is that it becomes an all or nothing proposition. Either I stop what I'm doing and wait for the next, cool shiny thing, or I say, the cool shiny thing isn't here yet, so I'm going to go all in and I'm stuck with good enough and my evolutionary approach for the next 30 years. What we're looking at is by being able to be federated, and I don't care if it's capabilities across 2 different services that haven't been, assured in a top-down way, or if it's just the evolution of a capability, a program of record within a service. I want to say, look, I've got this one capability that's what I have today. It was built to a certain set of capabilities, a certain set of performance, a certain set of requirements. Now if I can bring in something new, think of it as a new tile, maybe I start out by figuring out how can the new tile augment my current program of record. Oh, it's not bad at augmenting that. Maybe I'll get a few more of those new tiles while I buy the next block of my current program of record. Okay, now those new tiles by themselves are really having, I'm too loud, are really having a big impact. And at some point in time, you may get to a point where you say, you know what, I don't need to keep going with that legacy program of record because this new set of tiles is performing so well. So what I've done is, at the end of the day, I'm still making sure I've got a baseline set of capability I'm getting to the warfighter. But I'm getting away from this notion of we're defining an arbitrary set of capabilities that's based upon a projection and a forecasting of the future that no one really knows, but then applying the notion of 6 nines assurance against it. In your statistics class, it's the air of precision over accuracy. And that's what we're really trying to get away from, is how can we be accurate in sacrificing precision in the process?
And I can't resist, I gotta jump in here real quickly because you put your finger on something that's an enormous problem. And it always is in the Pentagon because the services organize, train, and equip with the combatant commands doing the employing. But what is necessary is a common vision. Then the services can go off and do their own thing to achieve that, plug into that common vision. And I dare say, let me start with the proposition that I believe all of the services would agree that having the capacity and capability in the future to be able to seamlessly and ubiquitously share information is something they could all agree upon. That's the fundamental tenet upon which this concept and many others reside. It's also some of the most challenging areas that we have to work with. So my 2 cents worth on that.
He's been very patient.
Yeah, thanks for a fantastic presentation, really interesting on a critically important topic. The discussion and examples were largely kinetic, and the certainly counter strategy in some words, is to win the war before the first shot is fired. Are we thinking of those Mosaic concepts in the areas of information warfare shaping, well left of kinetic?
So the short answer is sure, absolutely. The name of the game is heterogeneity, and if that's part of the mix, absolutely. I mean, the tiles in the palette are things that we don't want to talk about as much when we talk about non-kinetics, but that certainly would be part of the mix. I think animal, maybe you might want to mention some of the thinking. It's not yet a program, but you've been thinking some ideas even about how, new thinking of game theory and such, might apply.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, we're interested in the non-traditional ways of approaching these, creating effects, right? In fact, that's where we see our biggest potential is right now, those sorts of things are always white-carded. If you've gone to any large force exercise, these out-of-domain type of effects are always some sort of a white card that you get handed, and everyone shrugs and says, yeah, they played in the engagement or in the exercise, but you don't really trust it, right? And what ends up coming down to almost everything that we talk about with regard to including autonomy or artificial intelligence, machine learning, those sorts of things, it really ultimately comes down to trust and whether we trust these sorts of other domain tiles and how do we incorporate them into our learning without having and with the ability to address the authorities' challenges that oftentimes come with them, right? How do I create an ability to reason over these multiple domains with these challenges with regard to the authorities and make decisions that are meaningful to a human being that the human being will ultimately trust to inform the decision that they're going to make, and that the application of those algorithms or those ways of approaching this problem are not specifically focused only on the kinetic piece. That's just the one that we talk about a lot. It's not specifically focused on after hostilities kick off, but rather can propagate. They're agnostic, I guess, of the time and the medium in which you're operating in, and that's what we're trying to strive for.
That's why taking an effects-based approach is so important, because it's not the modality, the medium, or the vehicle by which you accomplish the desired outcome. It's what is the desired outcome that you want to achieve, and there are a variety of different ways to do it. And probably the best are the ones that are not kinetic.
We are limited by our own human heuristics with the way that we process these sorts of information, and computers can help us to observe the excess capacity that some of these things may bring to the table that just aren't in consideration right now.
And one of the reasons why we're deliberately abstract in terms of looking at functionality and not specific platforms. Thank you all so much for your time, for your additional patience. We do have a hard stop to enable Dr. Grayson to get back to another commitment that he has. So we appreciate you joining us today and for the extra 10 minutes of your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.